Go ahead, old man. Start the Tomcat. Then prove you know what failed.
Not in this hangar. Safety comes first.
What's in the envelope?
A question your checklist never asked.
Your initials are on this old work card.
Then read the missing line.
You were a Master Chief?
That is not why I came.
Before the engines roared, before anyone at Redstone understood the sealed envelope in Thomas Walker's hand, one warning had already been ignored. The air start cart had barely lost pressure. 3 hours earlier, that clue should have shifted the entire investigation. Instead, Staff Sergeant Ethan Brooks saw an 82-year-old visitor in worn clothes, heard him question the start valve command, and decided to make him the afternoon's entertainment. That was where the story truly began. Thomas stood lean beneath a faded navy blue work jacket, with a gray shirt, dark jeans, scuffed brown boots, and pale blue eyes fixed on the aircraft rather than the men around him. The F-14A Tomcat occupied the center bay of the fictional Naval Aviation Heritage Annex at Marine Corps Air Station Redstone. It was a United States Navy aircraft on museum loan, fully demilitarized and incapable of flight, but a joint team of Marine maintainers and civilian specialists had spent 2 years returning its engines to approved ground run condition. Earlier that afternoon, the team had towed it to the outdoor test pad, connected external electrical power and a high-pressure air start cart, posted a fire guard, cleared the intake and exhaust areas, and attempted its first engine start since restoration began. The electrical indications appeared normal. The command circuit energized. A muted click came from each nacelle, but neither engine rotated. The cart pressure barely changed. The team shut everything down, made the aircraft safe, and returned it to the hangar. Wiring checks and component tests produced no explanation. Brooks had been describing the failure when Thomas, waiting behind the visitor rail with the sealed document envelope, asked about the sound of the start valve command. Brooks looked at the old jacket, worn boots, and visitor badge, then answered by challenging him loudly enough for every Marine, civilian technician, and visitor nearby to hear. Several young mechanics smiled because their staff sergeant expected them to. One lifted a phone before Lance Corporal Ryan Cole motioned for him to put it away. Thomas turned toward Brooks and refused without raising his voice. When Brooks answered with a skeptical look, Thomas nodded toward the open tool carts, visitors, and narrow space behind the exhausts. You do not run 2 jet engines around loose equipment and a crowd. You tow the aircraft to an approved pad, clear the danger areas, post a fire guard, and use the checklist. If you want a trick, find a magician. If you want an engine start, begin with safety. Ryan looked at Brooks, waiting. The staff sergeant's expression tightened because the old visitor had corrected him without raising his voice. Fine. What makes you think you know why it failed outside? Thomas looked back at the Tomcat. He had come to deliver the sealed envelope to Restoration Director Elaine Mercer, but she had been delayed at a command meeting. Until Brooks issued his challenge, Thomas had intended to wait quietly. He stepped to the rail and stopped there rather than crossing without permission. When your team commanded the starter air valve, he asked, "Did the pressure at the cart fall?" Ryan answered first. "No, sir. It held almost steady." Thomas's eyes sharpened. "Then your air never reached the starter." Brooks gestured toward the test sheets. The valve solenoid energized. "I did not ask whether electricity reached the solenoid. I asked whether the valve opened." The hangar became still. Ryan remembered the flat pressure reading and the dull click that had seemed unimportant. Thomas waited until the young Marine met his eyes. "Tell me exactly what you heard," he said. For the first time that afternoon, the team stopped judging and began listening. Ryan described the failed start from beginning to end, while Thomas remained on the visitor's valve. Nobody had. The restoration team possessed excellent measurements, but the Tomcat had been silent for so long that none of the younger Marines had a living reference for normal. Brooks unfolded his arms. "You can build a theory from one click, but that does not make it correct." "No," Thomas agreed. "Evidence makes it correct. Let us find some." He asked for an escort, the restoration work cards, and permission to perform an exterior visual inspection. People pretending to possess expertise often reached for controls before asking about authority. Thomas did the opposite. Brooks signed him through the annex's visitor access procedure and assigned Ryan to remain beside him. The old veteran crossed the rail only after Ryan opened it. Up close, the Tomcat carried the layered history of a machine that had lived several lives. It entered Navy service in the late 1970s, served with carrier squadrons, passed through depot maintenance, and entered museum custody after the fleet retired the type in 2006. The restoration team had removed hazardous materials, rendered every weapons system permanently inert, and rebuilt only what was required for safe ground operation. Thomas began at the nose and moved toward the left intake. He did not stroke the fuselage or speak to it as though it were alive. He read it. He studied inspection paint, replaced access doors, and the difference between original Navy workmanship and later museum restoration. At one panel behind the intake, he stopped. For fasteners carried fresh witness marks. A fifth carried an older stripe beneath the paint, and the latch sat slightly lower than the surrounding surface. Was this bay opened during depreservation? Thomas asked. Ryan checked the electronic summary. The starter air control circuit was inspected. The panel is listed under a completed zone inspection. That was not my question. Ryan scrolled farther. No individual entry confirmed that mechanical lockout hardware inside the bay had been removed. Brooks stepped closer. There is no open discrepancy for that panel. Thomas looked at him. A missing entry is not proof that the work was done. He crouched, keeping his hands away from the latch. A faint yellow trace remained at the lower edge of the door. It was the remnant of preservation paint used to identify hardware placed in a transport-safe condition. Thomas requested every transfer and preservation record associated with the pneumatic start system, including unindexed scans from the year the aircraft entered storage. Brooks exhaled. Those boxes were scanned years ago. Then the answer may be hiding behind a bad file name. Ryan called the records room. While they waited, Thomas checked the opposite nacelle and found the same panel alignment and faded yellow trace. 2 engines, 2 failed starts, 2 panels showing the same evidence. He returned to the center line. Your technicians did not fail to repair a broken airplane, he said. They restored one so carefully that it is still obeying an order given almost 20 years ago. Brooks's skepticism no longer looked comfortable. What order? Thomas pointed toward the 2 access bays. Do not open. The records room delivered 3 digital folders and 1 archive box that had never been fully indexed. Ryan placed them on a clean work table away from the aircraft. The newest cards documented electrical continuity, pneumatic pressure, cockpit switch logic, fire detection, fuel sampling, lubrication servicing, and the removal of preservation tags. Nothing mentioned a remaining mechanical lockout. Thomas asked for the earliest transfer paperwork. Ryan opened a grainy skin dated shortly after the Tomcat left active Navy service. One sheet had been filed under structural preservation, even though a handwritten note referred to the air start system. Thomas recognized the form before the image finished loading. Near the bottom, a depot technician recorded that both starter air valve linkages were secured for long-term transport with removable locking collars. The next line directed the receiving activity to remove those collars before any attempt to motor the engines. The restoration database showed that the paper warning tags had been removed years later. It did not show that anyone had visually confirmed the collars themselves. Brooks leaned over the screen. If a collar remained, why did the valve position circuit indicate a command? Thomas placed one finger beside the diagram. Because the electrical side can receive the order while the mechanical side fails to complete its travel. A relay can click, a solenoid can energize, and a test light can illuminate. None of that guarantees starter air crossed the final inch. Civilian technician Martin Shaw pulled up the pneumatic schematic. If both collars remained in place, the cart would hold pressure exactly the way it did. Brooks read the old card again. Both sides, after all this work. People repeat what a checklist tells them, Thomas said. The new checklist said the tags were gone. It never carried forward the sentence explaining what the tags identified. Ryan felt the lesson settle uncomfortably. The modern record was not wrong. It was incomplete in a way that made a correct reading falsely reassuring. Brooks looked toward Thomas's sealed envelope. How did you know to search for that card? Thomas turned toward the left panel. Because I helped write the preservation note used for that modification. He explained that early Tomcats accumulated differences across production blocks, depot visits, and fleet changes. One maintenance practice could move through carrier squadrons before formal paperwork caught up. As a Navy aviation machinist's mate, Thomas had worked on engines, fuel systems, lubrication systems, and ground turn troubleshooting. He learned that an air start failure could sound electrical even when the obstruction was mechanical. He also learned never to trust memory alone when a work card could prove or disprove it. Ryan found a second sheet containing a sketch of the collar and its inspection location. Beside it sat an old quality assurance stamp, T. Walker. The initials were official and traceable, not a secret signature scratched into metal. Ryan looked from the stamp to Thomas. "This is yours." Thomas nodded. "It was my responsibility then. Today it is evidence, nothing more." Martin compared the sketch with the panel geometry and requested permission to open the bay under the current procedure. Brooks reached for the latch, but Thomas stopped him with two quiet words. "Tag out." The pneumatic system was depressurized, yet the formal lockout and independent verification had not been entered. Ryan retrieved the required tags and checklist. Only after two technicians confirmed the system safe did Martin remove the panel. Deep behind the bracket, something reflected a narrow band of yellow. Thomas did not smile. "Your starter has been waiting behind a closed door." The yellow reflection carried Thomas back to a carrier deck 44 years earlier, but the memory arrived through ordinary details. Salt drying on steel, hearing protection pressing against his head, a flashlight beneath one arm, and tired maintainers working before sunrise while the sea moved under their boots. Thomas had been a chief by then, experienced enough to trust his judgment and young enough to learn how quickly confidence became a hazard. During one maintenance period, a Tomcat starter air command produced a clean electrical indication, but only a flat metallic click near the engine bay. A junior technician wanted to replace the solenoid. Another blamed the ground cart. Senior Chief Raymond Bell made them stop and repeat the sequence from a safe distance. "Do not tell me what the gauge says," Bell said. "Tell me what happened between the command and the result." They found a mechanical restraint that had not completed its travel after maintenance. The lesson was not that old hands possessed magic. A system could satisfy several individual tests and still fail as a whole. Bell required Thomas to document the finding, brief the next watch, and revise the local card. "Experience that stays inside your head dies there," he told him. "Write it down, teach it, and let the next crew improve it." Back in the Heritage hangar, Martin positioned a mirror and inspection light inside the open bay. A removable collar remained behind the starter air linkage, still secured in the transit position. Its warning streamer was gone, and restoration paint disguised its outline. The opposite bay contained an identical collar. Nobody had broken a component or sabotaged the aircraft. A transfer instruction had lost one line as paper became scanned. Data and scanned data became a new checklist. Brooks stared into the bay. "We spent 3 days testing around hardware installed on purpose." "That happens when a safeguard outlives the note explaining it," Thomas replied. Martin examined the collar against the archived sketch. "The removal procedure is here, but the restoration director must authorize a configuration change." Thomas nodded. "Then wait for her." Brooks looked at the clock. The approved test window would close before sunset. "We could remove it in 5 minutes." Thomas met his eyes. "The machine has waited nearly 20 years. It can wait another day. A schedule is not permission." Before Brooks answered, Dr. Elaine Mercer entered carrying a binder and hearing protectors. She was the restoration director and the person who had invited Thomas after receiving a letter written in his careful block handwriting. She took in the open panel, lockout tags, archive box, and expressions around the table. "I see Master Chief Walker found the missing work card," she said. The retired title changed the room, but not Thomas's expression. Elaine reviewed every document before greeting him. Thomas handed her the sealed envelope containing training notes, photographs of the same airframe during depot work, and a maintenance notebook for the museum archive. None of it granted him authority over the present restoration. Elaine required Martin to document the collars, inspect the linkage, and obtain an independent quality assurance sign-off before removal. Thomas approved of every delay. Ryan read each step aloud while Brooks recorded the change. When the collars came free, they left clean arcs beneath the paint. Martin used a regulated pneumatic rig to verify full valve travel without attempting an engine start. This time the pressure changed, the linkage completed its movement, and a clear rush followed the mechanical click. Ryan looked at Thomas. "That is what it was supposed to sound like." Now you have a reference, Thomas said. Elaine closed the card only after every inspection was complete. Then she looked toward the test pad in the late afternoon light. We still have an approved window, but only if everyone agrees there will be no shortcuts. Brooks lowered his eyes before answering. No shortcuts. Preparation for the ground run took longer than removing the collars, and Thomas insisted that it should. An approved tractor towed the Tomcat from the hangar with wing walkers on both sides. Visitors moved to a distant observation area. Loose equipment was secured. The intake and exhaust danger zones were cleared. Chocks, fire extinguishers, communications, and a trained fire guard were placed. Martin collected fresh fuel, oil, and hydraulic samples while Ryan inspected the closed access panels. Brooks walked the checklist with unusual care. The sky remained clear, the wind stayed within limits, and the outdoor pad gave the engines open space. Only then did Elaine discuss who would occupy the cockpit. Brooks looked toward Thomas. You found the fault. You should finish it. Thomas did not accept immediately. Finding a fault does not make me current. Elaine opened her binder. Thomas had completed a Heritage Program cockpit evaluation 3 months earlier at a Navy Museum facility, reviewed the approved non-flight ground run checklist, passed the required screening for cockpit access, and been designated as a technical consultant for this restoration. A currently qualified ground run supervisor would control the sequence from the pad, and Elaine could stop the test at any moment. Thomas's experience mattered, but it did not place him above present rules. Brooks listened as Elaine read the authorization. The old visitor he had mocked had carried proof all afternoon and never used it to win an argument. Why did you not tell me? Brooks asked. Thomas adjusted his jacket cuffs. You did not ask why I was here. You decided who I was before I reached the rail. The answer landed without cruelty. Thomas continued. You challenged an old man because you expected failure to entertain your team. If I enter that cockpit, it will not be to rescue your pride or prove my worth. It will be because the aircraft is ready and the people responsible for it made the test safe. Brooks took a breath. Understood, Master Chief. Thomas looked at the checklist. Not yet. Understanding is. What you do differently next time. Ryan inspected the ladder and placed a step platform. Thomas removed his jacket, folded it over a chair, and accepted approved hearing protection and a communication lead. He climbed carefully, with Ryan close enough to assist, but wise enough not to treat age as helplessness. Once seated, Thomas compared every item with the restoration checklist rather than relying on memory. The cockpit had been stripped of classified and weapons functions, but its engine instruments, guarded switches, throttles, and start controls remained familiar. The team connected external electrical power and the high-pressure air start cart. Martin confirmed stable pressure. The ground director called each station. Fire guard ready. Intake clear. Exhaust clear. Personnel accounted for. Thomas repeated the responses through the headset. Elaine held the sequence until the last observer crossed behind the barrier. There would be no loose papers, raised phones, or jokes when the engines turned. She lowered her hand. Thomas rested his right hand near the start controls. Ground, cockpit. Request permission to begin the right engine sequence. The supervisor checked the board. Cockpit, ground. Right engine approved. Thomas scanned the panel with complete attention to the present. Starting right, he answered. Compressed air entered the Tomcat's starting system with a rising mechanical whine. This time the cart pressure dropped as predicted, and the right engine began to rotate. Ryan watched the ground station repeater while Martin monitored the air supply and Elaine tracked the checklist. Thomas waited for stable rotation, confirmed the required indications, and moved the right throttle from cutoff only after the supervisor called the engine ready for light-off. Ignition followed. A low rumble formed inside the nacelle, uneven for one breath, and then steadily stronger. Temperature rose within limits. Oil pressure appeared. The engine accelerated toward idle while Thomas scanned each gauge instead of looking toward the spectators. When the starter disengaged and the right engine settled into a controlled rhythm, the sound crossed the apron like distant thunder. The team confirmed the readings, inspected for leaks, and waited through the stabilization period. Brooks stood beside Ryan behind the marked line. One caller stopped all of this, he said through his hearing protection. Ryan kept his eyes on the repeater. The missing sentence stopped us from seeing it. Elaine authorized the left engine sequence only after the right side remained stable. Thomas acknowledged, verified the configuration, and began again. External air turned the starter. The engine reached the required rotation. Thomas introduced fuel and ignition at the approved point, then watched temperature, pressure, and speed rise together. For a few seconds, the left engine sounded rougher than the right, an ordinary hesitation after a long silence. Thomas held the sequence and allowed it to stabilize. The note deepened. 2 exhaust streams shimmered against empty pavement, and heat rolled safely across the cleared apron. From the visitor area, the sound pressed against the chest and traveled through the concrete. Marines who had laughed in the hangar now stood still. The moment did not make modern tools useless or prove instinct superior to procedure. Thomas's memory suggested a question. An archived work card supplied evidence. Current technicians verified the fault. The restoration director authorized the correction. A disciplined team made the run possible. Experience mattered because Thomas connected those pieces without pretending any one of them was enough. Inside the cockpit, he gave the ground director a small signal. Brooks saw no triumph in it. Thomas had not defeated the Marines. He had helped them finish their work. After the approved test interval, Elaine called for shutdown. Thomas repeated the instruction and reduced the systems in sequence. The left engine wound down first, its voice falling from a roar to a turbine sigh. The right followed after the required checks. When both rotors slowed, the quiet spread farther than the noise had. Thomas remained seated until the ground team confirmed external power isolated, starting air disconnected, and the aircraft safe to approach. Only then did Ryan move toward the ladder. Thomas looked once across the instrument panel before climbing down. The Marines had told him to start the Tomcat as a joke. The engines answered, but not because an old man performed a miracle. They roared because he refused to let a joke become more important than knowledge, evidence, and safety. After the aircraft was declared safe, the team returned to the hangar for the post-run inspection. Nobody crowded Thomas as he stepped from the ladder. Ryan offered an arm only when the older man reached the final step, and Thomas accepted it without embarrassment or ceremony. Brooks stood several feet away, searching for words that did not sound smaller than the moment. Before he found them, Elaine directed everyone back to work. Oil samples had to be collected. Access bays had to be checked. Every reading from the ground run had to be entered. The locking collars had to be preserved as artifacts with their history documented correctly. Success did not cancel procedure. It created more responsibility. Thomas put on his faded navy blue jacket and joined the debrief at the work table. He identified 2 engine indications that deserved monitoring during any future run, then asked Ryan to explain the root cause in his own words. Ryan did not say that an old expert had magically known the answer. He described the complete chain. The start command energized electrically, the mechanical linkage remained restrained, the ground cart retained pressure, the transfer record lost a line during digitization, and 2 preservation collars stayed installed after their paper tags disappeared. Thomas nodded. Now teach that without turning it into a legend. Ryan understood. Legends encouraged admiration. Accurate explanations prevented the next mistake. While Brooks completed the discrepancy report, Elaine opened the sealed envelope and compared Thomas's notebook with the archive box. One photograph showed a much younger Thomas beside the same airframe during depot work in 1978. Another showed him briefing a row of aviation machinists' mates beside a cutaway engine. His handwritten notes did not contain secret tricks. They recorded sounds, delays, pressure behavior, recurring faults, and questions that helped technicians separate an electrical command from a mechanical result. On the final page, one sentence had been underlined twice. If the indication and the outcome disagree, investigate the distance between them. Ryan searched the museum's public personnel index using Thomas's full rating and service dates. This time the results did not vanish behind a dramatic classification warning. They appeared slowly because many records were old and imperfectly scanned. Thomas Walker had retired as a Master Chief Aviation Machinist's mate after more than 30 years in the United States Navy. He had supported several carrier air wings, served on an F-14 engine reliability working group, trained maintainers at shore commands, and spent his final tour helping convert fleet experience into formal troubleshooting guidance. A later entry listed him as a volunteer consultant to naval aviation museums. Ryan found the same quality assurance stamp that appeared on the 1978 work card. It was not a hidden signature. It was a documented chain of responsibility connecting the young maintainer in the photograph to the man standing across the table. Elaine called the National Naval Aviation Museum archive to report the successful ground run and confirm receipt of Thomas's notebook. The archivist asked whether Thomas was still present. When Elaine said yes, the voice on the telephone changed. A Heritage Board meeting was already taking place in another building on the base, and one of its members had once flown Tomcats before rising through the Navy. The archivist requested a brief hold, then returned less than a minute later. "Rear Admiral Richard Hayes is on Redstone today," she said. He heard the engines from the meeting room. Elaine looked through the hangar doors toward the administration building across the flight line. "Does he want the test report?" "Eventually. First he asked one question." "What question?" The archivist lowered her voice even though Thomas was too far away to hear. "Is Master Chief Walker still there?" Elaine looked across the hangar. Thomas was helping Ryan place the 2 locking collars into evidence bags, apparently unaware that anyone important had asked for him. "Yes," she answered. "He is still here." Rear Admiral Richard Hayes arrived without a motorcade or stage ceremony. He crossed the apron in a single staff vehicle, stepped out near the marked pedestrian lane, and waited for the restoration team to clear him into the hangar. The Marines straightened when they recognized the Navy flag officer, but Hayes did not demand a formation. He signed the visitor log, put on the required safety glasses, and asked Elaine to finish the post-run brief before introducing anyone. That small decision told Thomas almost as much about the Admiral as the silver in his hair. When the documentation was complete, Hayes walked toward the work table and stopped in front of the old veteran. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then the Admiral smiled. "Master Chief Walker." Thomas returned the expression. "Rear Admiral Hayes. You finally learned to arrive after the maintenance was finished." A few Marines looked startled by the familiarity. Hayes laughed. "You spent years telling me that aircrew only showed up when the hard work was over." They shook hands, not as a performance for the room, but as 2 people reconnecting across decades. Hayes had been a young radar intercept officer when he first met Thomas at a Navy fighter squadron. During one difficult training cycle, Thomas had challenged a series of intermittent engine indications that other people were prepared to dismiss because each individual test remained within limits. He had not saved Hayes through a cinematic last-second act. He had done something less visible and more professional. Stopped the schedule, documented the pattern, brought engineering and maintenance control together, and refused to release the aircraft until the discrepancy was understood. The delay embarrassed people for one day and improved the squadron's troubleshooting process for years. "He taught us that caution was not fear," Hayes told the group. "It was discipline with enough courage to inconvenience a schedule." The Admiral glanced toward the Tomcat and the 2 preserved locking collars. "I heard you found another missing link." Thomas shook his head. "The team found it. I recognized where to look." Hayes turned to Ryan. "Can you explain the fault?" Ryan delivered the same clear account he had given during the debrief. The Admiral listened without interruption, then nodded toward Thomas. "That is how I know he taught you something. You described the system, not the man." Brooks stood at the edge of the group, visibly uncomfortable. The room now knew Thomas's retired rank, his history, and his connection to a flag officer. Yet none of those facts changed the way Brooks had treated an elderly visitor before he possessed them. He stepped forward. "Master Chief, I owe you an apology." Thomas faced him. "Yes, you do." The direct answer surprised everyone more than easy forgiveness would have. Brooks swallowed. "I judged you by your age and clothes. I turned a maintenance problem into a joke, and I invited my Marines to laugh with me. You also suggested an unsafe act inside a hangar because you assumed I could not perform it," Thomas said. "If I had accepted, your joke could have become everyone's problem." Brooks nodded. "You are right. My service record explains why I understood this aircraft. It is not the reason I deserved basic respect at the visitor rail." Thomas's voice remained quiet, but nobody looked away. "The next person you dismiss may have no rank, no admiral who knows him, and no engine to prove you wrong. Your standard still has to be the same." Hayes did not rescue Brooks from the discomfort or add a threat of punishment. Accountability belonged first to the Marine standing in front of Thomas. Brooks looked toward the young maintainers who had followed his laughter. "Then I need to correct more than my apology." Thomas nodded once. "That is where understanding begins." Brooks started with the people who had heard the joke. He gathered the Marines beside the work table and described his own conduct without softening it. He had judged a visitor by age and clothing, encouraged public ridicule, and spoken about an engine start as though safety procedures were part of the punchline. He did not blame the failed restoration schedule or the pressure of the open house. He asked each Marine who had laughed to consider why following the tone of a leader had felt easier than questioning it. Then he directed the team to revise the Heritage Annex visitor brief. Technical questions from veterans and civilians would be documented and evaluated on their substance. No visitor would be invited past a safety rail without authorization. No maintenance demonstration would be framed as humiliation. Phones would remain put away in controlled work areas, and anyone, regardless of rank, could call a stop when a joke began pushing against procedure. Thomas listened from the far side of the table. He did not need Brooks publicly disgraced, and he did not pretend one speech completed the change. When Brooks finished, Thomas asked what would happen after he left. The revised brief goes into tomorrow's opening meeting, Brooks answered. The missing preservation instruction goes into our lessons learned file. Ryan will teach the start system fault at next week's maintenance review, and I will be present to explain why the team overlooked his first question. Ryan had, in fact, mentioned the flat cart pressure during the original troubleshooting session. Brooks had dismissed it because the electrical indication looked normal, acknowledging that detail mattered. It shifted the lesson away from worshiping the oldest voice and toward hearing any evidence that challenged an easy conclusion. Elaine accepted Thomas's notebook into the archive and created a record linking its observations to the official work cards. She asked whether he would return for the next approved ground run. Thomas considered the question, then looked toward Ryan. Only if the junior maintainers lead the brief. Ryan smiled. We will be ready. Rear Admiral Hayes offered Thomas a ride after the annex closed, but Thomas chose to remain until the final inspection panels were secured. He and Ryan walked once around the Tomcat together. Thomas showed him how to compare a commanded sound with the physical response that should follow it, how to separate memory from evidence, and how to say, I do not know early enough for the words to become useful. He never described the aircraft as mystical. Machines did not remember people in the literal sense. People preserved memory through work cards, witness marks, notebooks, habits, and the willingness to teach. Before leaving, Thomas stopped beside Brooks. The staff sergeant extended his hand. I am sorry, Master Chief. Thomas accepted it. Make the apology true tomorrow. Brooks nodded. I will. There was no salute from an arranged line and no crowd waiting to celebrate the old veteran. The dignity of the moment did not require ceremony. Thomas put on his faded navy blue jacket, collected his empty document envelope, and walked toward the hangar doors beside Hayes. Behind them, Ryan placed a new copy of the recovered preservation instruction at the front of the restoration binder. The two yellow locking collars rested in labeled evidence bags, no longer forgotten pieces of metal, but proof of how easily one missing sentence could silence an entire system. Outside, sunset settled across the test pad where the Tomcat had run. Its engines were quiet again, but the sound remained in the minds of everyone who had heard it. The Marines would remember the roar because it was powerful. They would remember Thomas because he had been right. The lesson that mattered most, however, came before either revelation. Respect should not wait for proof, and experience becomes valuable only when it is joined to evidence, discipline, and the humility to keep listening.